The December wind howled across Broken Elm, slicing through Emmett Callahan's worn duster like a frozen knife. His weathered hands gripped the bank notice, the paper crackling in the bitter cold as townsfolk slowed their steps to watch. The foreclosure notice had been posted publicly, his 40 years of sweat and sacrifice reduced to bold black letters for all to see. His ranch, his legacy, scheduled for spring auction like common chattel. Reckon some men just can't keep up with the times, someone whispered loud enough for all to hear. Emmett's jaw tightened, his fingers trembling not from cold but from the burning shame rising in his throat. As he turned to leave, the judge's gold-nibbed pen gleamed in the winter sun like a silent promise of more humiliation to come. Morning came bitter to Broken Elm, the kind that turned breath to fog and made old bones ache like promises broken. Emmett Callahan stood on his porch, collar turned high against the wind that cut across the plains like a hungry wolf. His gnarled hands raised his grandfather's spyglass to one eye, the brass cold against his weathered skin. The ritual was as much a part of him as breathing, 40 years scanning these boundaries, knowing every fence post and cattle trail like the lines on his palm. The metal warmed slightly beneath his grip as he swept the lens across his property line. "Something don't sit right," he muttered. Through the glass, the world narrowed to detail. Fresh tracks cut across his north pasture. Not deer or coyote. Man tracks. Bootprints too neat for a drifter, too purposeful for a lost traveler. Inside, Hannah Kirby's spoon clinked against the stove as she stirred breakfast. The smell of coffee and fatback filled the small kitchen, fighting against the draft that slipped through window frames. "Riders?" she asked, not looking up when he entered it. Her hands were red from lye soap and cold water, but steady as always. Hannah had kept house for him since Miriam passed, 15 years now. "Just one," cutting across the north corner. Emmett hung his hat on the peg, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Third time this week." Hannah set a steaming mug before him, the coffee dark as creek water after spring melt. "Judge's men, you reckon?" Before Emmett could answer, a small sound came from the back room, a child's cough. Sarah had arrived just last week, half frozen in the blizzard, daughter of his wife's cousin from back east, they'd said. No one else to take her after the fever took her parents. Emmett had never figured on raising someone else's child at his age, but blood was blood. The girl appeared in the doorway, eyes still heavy with sleep. Her dark hair fell in tangles around a face too thin for a child her age. "Good morning, sir," she said, formal as Sunday service. Emmett nodded once. Words never came easy to him, less so since Miriam died. He returned to the window, raising the spyglass once more. Someone's testing boundaries, and not just the property kind. The bank smelled of polish and paper. Emmett removed his hat as he entered, stomping snow from his boots on the threshold mat. The floor creaked beneath him, announcing his arrival better than any bell. Marcus Beaumont didn't look up from his ledger, his pen scratching across the page like a rodent burrowing for seed. Only when Emmett cleared his throat did the banker raise his head, spectacles catching the weak winter light from the frosted windows. "Mr. Callahan," he said, voice neutral as spring water. "I didn't expect you today." "Mortgage payment," Emmett said, placing coins and bills on the counter. He'd counted 3 times at the kitchen table before riding in. Every dollar earned from selling 2 prime steers to the butcher in Adams Creek. Beaumont counted slowly, fingers moving with practiced precision. His mouth tightened at the corners. "This is $3 short, Mr. Callahan." "Can't be. Counted it myself." "Interest adjusted last quarter. Notice was sent." The banker tapped a yellowed paper beside his ledger. Terms clearly state quarterly adjustments based on territorial rates. The room suddenly felt smaller. Behind Emmett, the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the murmur of voices. Judge Thorne's clerk and 2 ranchers from the South Valley. The timing wasn't accidental. Nothing in Broken Elm happened by chance anymore, not since the railroad survey. "I can bring the rest next week," Emmett said, keeping his voice low. The coins on the counter seemed to mock him. Beaumont's ledger slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. "Bank policy requires full payment, Mr. Callahan. Partial payments are no longer accepted." "Been doing partial for 15 years, Marcus." That was before. Beaumont glanced toward the new arrivals, then lowered his voice. "Times are changing. The Territorial Bank has new regulations." From the corner, Judge Thorne's clerk watched with undisguised interest, his fingers toying with a gold-nibbed pen, same as the judge carried. Beaumont slid the money back across the counter. The coins clinked together, a sound like small bells announcing failure. "You have until the first thaw, Mr. Callahan. Full payment then, or foreclosure proceedings begin." Outside, the cold air hit Emmett like a slap. His breath clouded before him as he mounted his horse. The animal shifted beneath him, sensing his mood. "The bank ain't just collecting debts, Mr. Callahan," Beaumont had whispered as Emmett left. "It's collecting land." The blizzard came without warning. One minute the sky was clear, hard as blue steel, and the next it was nothing but white fury. Wind screamed around the corners of Emmett's house like a wounded animal while ice particles stung any exposed skin. Emmett stood at the window, watching the fence line disappear into the white void. The smell of pine from the wood stove filled the room, fighting against the damp chill that seeped through the walls. Hannah had built the fire higher than usual, burning through precious winter wood. "She'll hold," Emmett said, more to himself than anyone. The house had weathered worse. 40 years of Dakota storms had tested every nail and board. A sound cut through the howl of wind, something striking the front door. Not the random tap of ice, but deliberate. 3 knocks, weak but human. Hannah looked up from her mending, needle frozen mid-stitch. Sarah stopped her sweeping, clutch broom standing upright like a soldier. "Someone's out in this?" Hannah whispered, voice tight with disbelief. Emmett crossed to the door, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. The knob was cold enough to burn his palm as he pulled it open, letting in a violent gust of snow and wind. Huddled on his porch was a shape so small he almost missed it. A child, a girl, with skin gone blue-white from cold. She couldn't have been older than 10 or 11, her thin frame draped in a coat several sizes too large. In her arms, clutched tight to her chest, was a worn leather satchel. "Please," the girl whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely audible over the storm. Her eyes, wide and dark against her pale face, locked onto Emmett's. "They said a man named Callahan." She swayed dangerously, and Emmett moved without thinking, catching her before she fell. Her weight was nothing in his arms, like carrying a half-empty flour sack. "Hannah," he called, already turning toward the fire. The girl's clothes were stiff with ice, her hair frozen in clumps around her face. Hannah was already there, pulling blankets from the chest, while Sarah filled a basin with warm water. The satchel tumbled from the girl's arms as Emmett set her near the stove, the leather case falling open. Papers spilled across the floor, worn pages filled with numbers, strange markings, and what looked like survey notes. Among them, a small notebook with a faded leather cover caught Emmett's eye. The girl's eyes fluttered. "Don't let them have it," she murmured, her cold fingers reaching weakly for the fallen papers. Outside, the church bell began to ring, its mournful tone cutting through the storm, a warning, a signal for those caught in the blizzard to head toward safety. Preacher Wilson would be opening the church doors for travelers. As Hannah peeled away the girl's frozen coat, Emmett knelt beside her. "What's your name, child?" "Sarah," she whispered. Then her eyes widened as she saw him clearly. Her body tensed, seeming to shrink further into the blankets. Her next words came out so soft he almost missed them. "Sir, can I slip under your coat?" the young girl whispered. The silent rancher froze in shock. The town hall smelled of damp wool and wood polish. Bodies packed the benches, their breath fogging the air despite the roaring stove in the corner. The storm had passed, but the cold had only deepened, settling into the bones of broken elm like a stubborn guest. Emmett stood at the back, hat in hand, shoulders squared. The room buzzed with whispers that died as Judge Abram Thorne took his position at the front table. The judge was a tall man, with silver at his temples and eyes the color of river ice. His black coat was impeccably pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud and slush outside. "Given the severe weather conditions," Thorne began, his voice carrying easily to every corner, "the town council has decided to accelerate certain proceedings before the passes close entirely." Metal scraped against wood as his clerk arranged papers on the table. The sound cut through the murmurs like a knife. "First order, land auction schedule." Thorne unfolded a document with practiced ceremony. "Due to numerous requests from potential investors, spring auctions will be moved forward. First Monday of March rather than April." A wave of muttering swept the room. March meant barely time for winter to break. No chance for spring cattle sales to raise funds. No time for repairs to raise property values. Emmett's stomach tightened. His eyes met Hannah's across the room, where she sat with the 2 girls. Sarah, still pale but recovering, sat unnaturally still, watching the judge with undisguised wariness. Beside her, little Sarah, his Sarah, he found himself thinking, looked confused by the proceedings. "Next item," Thorne continued. "Property documentation review." The list began. Names called, papers examined, all in order. Until Emmett Callahan, North Homestead, 160 acres. Emmett stepped forward, conscious of every eye on him. From his pocket, he withdrew his deed, the paper soft with age and handling. He'd paid the final dollar 23 years ago. The land was his, free and clear. Judge Thorne examined the document, turning it in manicured hands. His brows drew together in exaggerated concern. "Mr. Callahan, I see an irregularity here." He held the deed up to the light. The notary seal appears incomplete. "That's the original seal, placed by Judge McAllister himself," Emmett said, voice steady despite the sudden coldness in his chest. 23 years ago. Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unfortunately, territorial law requires a complete double eagle seal. This one," he pointed to a faded mark on the paper, "is missing the left wing impression. Technically, this deed is provisional at best." The room had gone silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its crackling. "That's impossible," Emmett said. "McAllister signed it himself." "I don't doubt that," Thorne replied smoothly, "but the law is clear. Without proper certification, your claim falls under review." He made a show of consulting another document. "Given the circumstances, including recent reports of a minor child taken in without proper guardianship documentation, your property will be included in the accelerated auction schedule." Heat rose in Emmett's face. "That child was half dead in a blizzard. You suggesting I should have left her to freeze?" "Of course not." Thorne's voice dripped false sympathy. "I'm merely pointing out a pattern of irregularities. First the deed, now an unauthorized wardship." From her seat, Hannah made a small sound of outrage. Sarah, the newcomer, stared at her hands, her face a mask of guilt. "This is my land," Emmett said, each word carved from ice. "Paid for in full, worked by my hands for 40 years. Judge Thorne slid the deed back across the table. "The auction will proceed as scheduled, Mr. Callahan. First Monday of March." His eyes, calculating and cold, flicked toward the girls. Sometimes the law has to step in when a man can't properly care for what's his, or who he takes in. Dawn painted the eastern sky with pale fingers of light. The cold had deepened overnight, turning breath to ice crystals that hung in the air like tiny diamonds. Emmett's boots crunched through snow as he crossed the yard to the barn, the familiar scent of hay and livestock wrapping around him like an old friend. Inside, the warmth of animals pushed back against the winter chill. His 2 draft horses nickered softly at his approach, steam rising from their broad backs. The leather of the harness felt stiff and cold as he lifted it from its peg. A small sound made him turn. The new girl, Sarah, same as his Sarah, stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket over her borrowed clothes. Her dark eyes watched him with a wariness that reminded him of a half-wild colt. "Hannah says I should help with chores," she said, her voice still raspy from the cold that had nearly taken her. Emmett nodded, gesturing to a bucket. "Chickens need feed." She moved with surprising sureness, scooping grain as if she'd done it 100 times before. Her small hands worked methodically, no wasted motion. Not a city child, then. "Your land goes to the creek, doesn't it?" she asked suddenly, pausing in her work. "South line follows the water," Emmett replied, surprised. "How'd you know that?" She didn't answer directly, just set down the feed bucket and returned to the house. Emmett followed, curiosity overcoming his usual reserve. Inside, warmth from the cook stove had driven back the morning chill. The smell of biscuits filled the kitchen, making his stomach growl. Hannah looked up from her kneading, flour dusting her forearms. "Girl's been asking about the property since dawn," she said. "Peculiar questions for a child." Sarah had retrieved her satchel and was spreading papers across the kitchen table. Emmett recognized survey notes, longitude markings, elevation points, boundary descriptions. "My grandfather was a land surveyor," she explained, fingers tracing lines on yellowed paper. "He taught me to read these when I was little." She found a blank page and with quick, sure strokes began to sketch. The pencil scratched softly against the paper, the only sound besides the popping of the stove. When she finished, she pushed the drawing toward Emmett. It was a map. His land, every creek, bend, ridge, and valley drawn with uncanny accuracy. The northern boundary followed exactly the line his grandfather had established decades ago. "How could you know this?" Emmett asked, voice rough with disbelief. A knock at the door interrupted before she could answer. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron and answered it. Hank Redfeather stood on the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. The blacksmith was Lakota, his face weathered as old leather, black hair streaked with silver and tied back with a leather cord. Thought you might need these fixed, he said, holding up a pair of broken harness rings. Steam rose from the metal in the cold air. Was passing anyway. Emmett nodded his thanks, gesturing the man inside. Hank's eyes fell immediately on the papers spread across the table, recognition flashing across his face. Survey notes, he said, not a question. Old ones. Sarah gathered the papers protectively. My grandfather's. What was his name? Hank asked gently. Thomas Elkins. Hank and Emmett exchanged glances. Thomas Elkins had surveyed most of the territory before the war, establishing the original boundary markers that defined every property for 50 miles. My grandpa said good land has 2 deeds, Sarah continued softly, one on paper and one in the heart. Hank Redfeather's forge glowed orange in the deepening afternoon, pushing back the shadows that gathered in the corners of the blacksmith shop. Heat radiated in waves, a welcome relief from the bitter cold outside. The air smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, and the sharp tang of quenching oil. Emmett placed his deed carefully on the workbench, away from flying sparks. Judge claims the seal's incomplete. Says that makes my claim provisional. Hank's hammer struck the anvil with practiced precision, the sound ringing like a bell. Sparks cascaded to the dirt floor with each blow. Judge Thorne finds what he's looking for, he said, voice measured, and doesn't find what he doesn't want to see. Sarah stood near the door, watching everything with those 2 old eyes. She'd insisted on coming, clutching her grandfather's satchel as if it contained gold. Hank set his hammer down and wiped his hands on his leather apron. The forge light cast deep shadows across the planes of his face as he took the deed, holding it up to the light from the single window. Seal's faded, not incomplete, he said after careful examination. See how the impression cuts off here? Paper's been trimmed, recently, by the look of it. Trimmed? Emmett took the document back, squinting at the edge. You're saying someone cut my deed? Hank nodded slowly. Wouldn't be the first time papers get adjusted when valuable land comes into question. The judge wants our land because of the water rights, Sarah said suddenly. Both men turned to her. My grandfather's notes show an underground spring network connecting all the properties Judge Thorne has been buying. He's creating a water monopoly for when the railroad comes. The blacksmith's eyes narrowed. How would you know the judge's purchases? Sarah opened her satchel, withdrew a folded newspaper clipping. Been keeping track. 5 farms in the last year, all along the same watershed. Emmett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. You came looking for me specifically, didn't you? Before she could answer, the shop door opened, letting in a blast of cold air that made the forge flames dance. Judge Thorne stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. His eyes took in the deed on the bench, the girl, the gathering of men. Quite the meeting, he said, voice smooth as polished stone. I do hope I'm not interrupting some sort of conspiracy. Hank moved with deliberate calm, returning to his anvil. His hammer struck metal again, sparks flying. Just fixing Mr. Callahan's plow blade, he said, face unreadable. Thorne stepped further into the shop, the smell of expensive cologne cutting through the forge smoke. His eyes lingered on Sarah, who stared back with undisguised hostility. I see our young visitor is recovering well, he said. The county clerk will be inquiring about proper guardianship papers, Mr. Callahan. Children can't simply be collected. She's blood kin, Emmett replied, the lie coming easily to his lips. My wife's cousin's child. Indeed. Thorne's smile never reached his eyes. I'm sure you have documentation to that effect. And he turned to leave, then paused at the door. I noticed you examining that deed rather closely, Mr. Redfeather. I do hope you remember that fraudulent authentication of legal documents carries severe penalties in this territory. After he left, silence filled the shop, broken only by the hiss and pop of the forge. Hank held the deed up once more, angling it toward the fire. The parchment seemed to glow around the edges, revealing irregularities in the ink that weren't visible in normal light. Some marks only show themselves under the right kind of heat, Emmett, he said quietly. Just like some men. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes old timbers crack and breath hang visible in the air. Church bells rang across Broken Elm, their sound carrying for miles across the snow-covered plain. The town gathered as they always had, families bundled against the cold, boots squeaking across packed snow as they climbed the church steps. Emmett rarely attended services, Faith was something he kept private, between himself and the land. But today, Sarah, his Sarah, had asked to go, and the new girl needed proper introduction to the community. Hannah had insisted. Folks are talking, she'd said that morning, pinning her gray hair tight beneath her Sunday bonnet. Better they see the child properly, not through gossip and whispers. The church smelled of pine boughs and beeswax candles. Heat from the pot-bellied stove in the corner barely reached the back pews where Emmett sat with the girls on either side of him. Hannah had positioned herself strategically among the town wives, her ears open for whatever tales circulated. Preacher Wilson stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him. His gaze swept the congregation, pausing briefly on Emmett and the girls before continuing. Today, he began, voice resonant in the small space, we consider Proverbs 27:12. The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Hymn books rustled as people shifted in their seats. From the front pew, Judge Thorne turned slightly, his profile sharp against the whitewashed wall behind him. Beside him sat Marcus Beaumont and three men Emmett recognized as investors from the territorial capital. The sermon drifted from scripture to more immediate concerns. Progress comes to all communities, Wilson continued. The railroad, new businesses, growth that benefits everyone, if we are prudent enough to welcome it. The words hung in the air like frost. Emmett felt eyes on him from all sides. The younger Sarah pressed closer to his side, sensing the tension. The older girl sat straight-backed, her face carefully blank. After the final hymn, congregants gathered outside despite the cold. Steam rose from cups of coffee provided by the Ladies' Aid Society. Conversation hummed like bees, stopping and starting as people moved between groups. Hannah rejoined them, her mouth set in a grim line. Judge has been busy, she murmured, taking the younger Sarah's hand. Before Emmett could ask what she meant, Judge Thorne approached, flanked by Beaumont. The banker looked uncomfortable, eyes darting between the judge and Emmett like a rabbit sensing predators. Mr. Callahan, Thorne said, voice pitched to Carrie. How fortunate to see you in church today. And with your wards. Several nearby conversations hushed as people turned to listen. Just being neighborly, Emmett replied, keeping his voice neutral. Thought the girls might enjoy the singing. Indeed, Thorne smiled, all teeth. I wonder if I might have a word about a possible solution to your situation. He gestured toward the church steps, now empty as people dispersed. Reluctantly, Emmett followed, leaving the girls with Hannah. The judge's boots clicked against the frozen wood of the steps. Up close, Emmett could smell expensive cologne and tobacco. I understand your attachment to that land, Thorne began, his breath clouding between them. Family history, sentimental value, but you must see that holding out against inevitable progress only hurts you, and now, those in your care. Get to your point, Emmett said. I'm prepared to offer a generous price, well above market value, as a charitable consideration. The judge's smile thinned, enough to relocate comfortably and provide properly for the children. Emmett felt heat rise in his face despite the cold. Charitable consideration? Of course. Thorne's voice dripped false sympathy. A widower, struggling financially, suddenly responsible for two young girls. The town has concerns, Mr. Callahan. Very legitimate concerns. From the churchyard, Emmett could feel eyes on them, the congregation watching, speculating, some with genuine worry, others with calculated interest. The younger Sarah looked confused, while the older one watched with thinly veiled anger. My land's not for sale, Emmett said, each word sharp as ice. Not to you, not to the railroad, not to anyone. The judge's facade of benevolence slipped, just for a moment. Something cold and calculating showed beneath. A wise man knows when to fold, Callahan, before the whole town sees what poor hand he's holding. The kitchen fire had died to embers, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling through cracks in the window frames with a sound like distant crying. Emmett sat at the table, a cup of coffee gone cold before him, his mind too restless for sleep. 3 days had passed since the church confrontation. 3 days of strange quiet, broken only by the routine of chores and meals. The girls had taken to each other, their whispered conversations stopping whenever he entered a room. A sharp knock at the door cut through the silence. 3 quick raps, official, demanding. Emmett rose, shoulders tense. Visitors after dark in this weather meant trouble. He opened the door to find Sheriff Taylor on his porch, hat in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him, backlit by a lantern, stood Judge Thorne's clerk. "Evening, Emmett," the sheriff said, his breath fogging. "Need a word." The men stomped snow from their boots as they entered. The clerk, Perkins, Emmett recalled, carried a leather document case tucked protectively under one arm. The smell of wet wool and horse filled the small kitchen. "Girls asleep?" Sheriff Taylor asked, eyes darting toward the back rooms. Emmett nodded, suddenly wary. "What's this about, Jim?" The sheriff sighed, removing his gloves. "Got some papers here. County business." He nodded toward Perkins, who opened his case and removed an official-looking document. "This is a notification of wardship investigation," Perkins said, his nasal voice carrying in the quiet room, "regarding the minor female child currently residing at this address without proper documentation." "Which one?" Emmett asked, his voice dangerously soft. Perkins consulted the paper. "Sarah Elkins, age approximately 12 years. No record of familial connection to one Emmett Callahan." From the doorway to the back rooms, a small gasp. The older Sarah stood there, her face pale in the dim light. She'd been listening. "Judge Thorne has petitioned the county court to review this irregular guardianship arrangement," Perkins continued, avoiding Emmett's eyes. "Given the circumstances, unchaperoned, improper accommodations, financial instability—" "Jim," Emmett cut in, addressing the sheriff directly, "you know damn well what this is about." Sheriff Taylor had the decency to look ashamed. "It's not my call, Emmett. Judge has concerns, legitimate concerns on paper." "His concern is my water rights," Emmett said flatly. Sarah stepped fully into the room, her thin shoulders squared. "I don't want to go," she said, voice stronger than Emmett had yet heard it. "He just wants my grandfather's papers." Perkins' eyes narrowed at this. "The child appears distressed and possibly confused," he noted, as if documenting evidence. "She ain't confused," Emmett said. "She sees clearer than most grown folks around here." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Look, nothing's decided yet. This is just notification of review." He reached into his coat and pulled out another folded document, this one unofficial. "But Thorne wanted you to have this too. Said it might simplify matters." Emmett took the paper, a deed transfer pre-filled with his name and land description. The offered price was indeed generous, on paper, but words like charitable consideration and due to personal hardship jumped out at him, burning like brands. "Get out," Emmett said quietly. "There's a process, Mr. Callahan," Perkins began, but the sheriff put a restraining hand on his arm. "We've delivered the notice," Taylor said. "That's all we needed to do tonight." He put his hat back on, nodding once to Emmett. "Hearing's set for when the first thaw comes. Judge says you have till then to consider your options." After they left, Emmett stood in the doorway, watching their lantern disappear down the snow-covered track toward town. The cold air bit at his face, but he barely felt it. Behind him, Sarah remained frozen in place, her face a mask of guilt and fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault." Emmett shook his head, closing the door against the night. "Been coming a long time. You're just the excuse he needed. What will happen to me?" The question hung in the air between them. Emmett had no answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. Instead, he stoked the fire, adding logs until warmth began to reclaim the room. "You've got till first thaw to decide, Callahan," the sheriff had said at the door, his voice low and regretful. "The girl or the land, because you sure can't keep both." January brought deeper cold, the kind that turned metal brittle and made breathing feel like swallowing knives. Frost crept across window panes in lacy patterns, reclaiming any spot warmed by a passing hand or breath. The land lay silent beneath a blanket of snow, fences and boundaries hidden, as if the earth had forgotten the claims men placed upon it. Emmett stood in the north pasture, mending a section of fence damaged by drifting snow. The wind cut through his coat, finding every seam and worn spot. His breath clouded around his head like a ghostly halo as he worked, fingers stiff within his worn leather gloves. Beside him, the older Sarah struggled with a length of wire, her small hands determined but awkward with the unfamiliar task. Cold rain had begun to fall, a miserable mix of ice and water that would freeze solid by nightfall. It plastered her dark hair to her forehead and soaked through her borrowed coat. "Hold it steady," Emmett instructed, demonstrating with his own section. "Wrap twice, then pull with the pliers." Sarah nodded, brow furrowed in concentration. The wire bit into her palms, even through the gloves. But she didn't complain. The metal strands clinked softly as she twisted them together, the sound almost lost in the patter of freezing rain. From the house, Hannah appeared, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "Storm's getting worse," she called, voice thin against the wind. Best come in before it turns to proper ice. Emmett shook his head. Need to finish this section. Cattle will be pushing through come morning if we don't. Hannah frowned but retreated to the warmth of the house. Sarah remained, her determination matching Emmett's own. You should go in, he told her. No sense both of us catching fever. I want to help, she replied simply, wrapping another section of wire. A thin line of blood appeared on her wrist where the metal had caught her skin. She didn't seem to notice. Emmett paused, watching her work. The child moved with purpose beyond her years, each motion deliberate despite the awkwardness of unfamiliarity. She reminded him of himself at that age, stubborn, solemn, shaped by necessity rather than childhood's natural course. Why'd you come here? He asked finally. The question had burned in him since her arrival. The truth, not what you think I want to hear. Sarah's hands stilled. Rain dripped from her chin as she looked up at him, her eyes direct. My grandfather mapped this whole territory. Before he died, he told me something wasn't right with the new surveys. Said a man named Callahan was the only one who still had an original deed with his seal. And you thought I could help you prove something? She nodded. Then I found out Judge Thorne was buying up all the properties along the water line, same as he did back in Missouri. You followed him here? After my parents died. Got work in kitchens, listened to talk. Judge doesn't notice children. Her fingers resumed their work on the fence, more confident now. Didn't plan on getting caught in no blizzard, though. The rain fell harder, drumming against Emmett's hat brim. His hands ached with cold, old scars pulling tight across his knuckles. Yet he continued working, showing rather than telling how to finish the job right. A strand of wire slipped, slicing across his palm. Blood welled immediately, bright against weathered skin. Sarah gasped, reaching for his hand. It's nothing, he said, wiping it on his coat. Part of the work. Does it always hurt? She asked, eyeing his collection of scars. Emmett considered this. Not after a while. You just learn to work through it. They finished the section as darkness began to fall. The repaired fence stood strong against the wind, wire wrapped tight around weathered posts. It wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it would hold. As they gathered their tools, Sarah looked up at the dark clouds scudding across the early evening sky. Will Judge Thorne really take me away? Emmett's throat tightened. He had no pretty lies to offer. He'll try, he said finally. Man like that, used to getting his way. In the land? That too. She nodded, accepting this harsh truth without childish protest. They walked back toward the house in silence, their boots crunching through the freezing crust forming on the snow. Halfway there, Emmett paused, gesturing toward the repaired fence barely visible in the gathering gloom. Some things break clean, girl. Others leave jagged edges that need proper tending. The January thaw came unexpectedly. 3 days of sun warm enough to melt the top layer of snow into slush. Water ran in rivulets across frozen ground, unable to penetrate the still solid earth beneath. The world turned to mud and mist, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. Emmett took advantage of the brief respite in weather to check the property boundaries, particularly where they ran along Judge Thorne's recently acquired parcels. Both Sarahs accompanied him, the younger skipping ahead despite the mud that clung to her boots, the older walking quietly beside him, eyes constantly scanning the landscape. Hannah had packed them biscuits wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven. The smell of butter and flour wafted from Emmett's pocket as they walked, a promise of simple comfort for later. My grandfather said every surveyor has his own mark, the older Sarah explained as they walked, a way of signing his work that most folks wouldn't notice. What was his? Emmett asked. He'd chip a small arrow pointing true north on the bottom side of boundary stones. Said that way, even if someone moved the marker, the arrow would tell the truth. They followed the creek that marked the southern boundary, now swollen with meltwater. Ice still clung to the banks and lacy sheets, cracking and shifting as the water rose beneath it. The sound of it breaking free punctuated their conversation, sharp snaps like distant gunfire. At the southeast corner, where Emmett's land met two others, a large boundary stone stood half buried in the earth. It had been placed there before Emmett was born, one of the original survey markers from when the territory was first divided. Generations of freezing and thawing had pushed it partially onto its side, but the territorial mark was still visible on its face. The older Sarah circled it slowly, examining each side with careful attention. Help me clear around it, she said suddenly, dropping to her knees in the mud. The younger Sarah joined her immediately, small hands scooping away mud and melting snow from around the base of the stone. Emmett knelt beside them, using his knife to clear the more stubborn earth. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as they worked, casting long shadows across the churned mud. Sweat beaded on Emmett's forehead despite the lingering chill. His joints protested the awkward position, old injuries reminding him of their presence. "There," the older Sarah exclaimed, pointing to a spot where the stone met earth. "That's it." Emmett leaned closer. Nearly hidden beneath decades of dirt and weathering, a small arrow had been chiseled into the underside of the stone, pointing precisely north. The mark was deliberate, careful, the work of a man who took pride in accuracy. "My grandfather's mark," Sarah said, voice hushed with something like reverence. "This is one of his original survey points." Emmett sat back on his heels, understanding dawning. "And if we find more of these markers, we can prove the original boundaries," Sarah finished, "and show that the new survey lines Judge Thorne is using don't match the original grants." The younger Sarah, not fully understanding but caught up in their excitement, suddenly pointed toward the tree line. "Someone's watching us." Emmett turned sharply. A rider sat motionless among the bare trees, too distant to identify clearly. The horse shifted, and the figure turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. "One of the judge's men," Emmett said, standing slowly. His knee popped loudly in protest, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. The older Sarah stood as well, mud caking her skirts. In her hand she clutched a small chunk of stone that had broken free from the marker, a piece bearing part of her grandfather's arrow. "That marker ain't just stone, it's testimony," Emmett said quietly. "And testimony's what we're going to need." The church bell tolled across Broken Elm, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Winter had reasserted its grip after the brief thaw, snow falling in heavy, wet flakes that muffled sound and covered tracks. The world seemed wrapped in cotton, still and watchful. Emmett helped Hannah down from the wagon, then lifted the younger Sarah to the ground. The older girl climbed down herself, clutching her grandfather's satchel. She hadn't let it out of her sight since they'd found the boundary marker. "Do we have to go?" she whispered to Emmett, eyes darting toward the church steps where Judge Thorne stood greeting parishioners, his smile fixed and cold as the winter sun. "Sometimes standing your ground means showing up where you're not wanted," Emmett replied quietly. They entered the church as a group, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the bitter cold. Candles flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows across whitewashed walls. The air smelled of pine boughs and beeswax, with undertones of damp wool from snow-covered coats. Heads turned as they made their way to a pew. Conversations hushed, then resumed with greater intensity. Emmett caught fragments as they passed. "Keeping both girls now," and "can't manage his own affairs," and "judge says the auction's certain." Hannah's back stiffened at the whispers, but she kept her chin high. The girls settled between them, a protective arrangement that wasn't lost on the watching congregation. Preacher Wilson took his place at the pulpit, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townsfolk before settling briefly on Emmett's family. Something like apology flickered in his eyes before he opened his Bible. "Today, we consider progress," he began, voice resonant in the hushed space. "Isaiah 43:19 tells us, 'Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert.'" The sermon that followed was carefully crafted, speaking of change and growth, of old ways giving way to new, the railroad, the bank expansion, new territorial laws, all presented as inevitable as the changing seasons, all part of God's plan for prosperity. "Some resist these changes," Wilson continued, careful not to look directly at Emmett, "clinging to the past out of fear or pride. But we must ask ourselves, are we standing firm on principle, or are we simply refusing to see the way forward that Providence has provided?" The wooden pew creaked as Emmett shifted his weight. The words weren't subtle in their target. Most eyes in the congregation darted toward him at the preacher's pointed question. When the final hymn ended, Emmett stood quickly, guiding his family toward the door. Judge Thorne stepped into their path, his hand extended in a gesture of false fellowship. "Mr. Callahan," he said, voice pitched to Carrie, "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer." The church had gone quiet, attention focused on the confrontation. Emmett felt the girls press closer to his sides. "Been considering it," Emmett replied, meeting the judge's gaze steadily. "Considered it's worth about as much as snow in summer." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Thorne's smile tightened at the edges. "Stubborn pride is a luxury you can ill afford, Mr. Callahan," especially with dependents to consider. His gaze slid meaningfully toward the girls. Seems to me, Emmett said, voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear, a man standing alone ain't necessarily standing wrong, just harder to knock down. The bank's interior felt colder than the February air outside. Emmett stomped snow from his boots as he entered, hat in hand. Marcus Beaumont looked up from his ledger, surprise evident on his thin face. Behind him, the clock ticked loudly in the silence, its brass pendulum catching the weak winter sunlight from the window. "Mr. Callahan," the banker said, setting down his pen. The ink left a small blue stain on his fingertips. "I wasn't expecting you today." "Wasn't planning to come," Emmett admitted, approaching the counter. The smell of paper and ink hung in the air, underlaid with the mustiness of old money. "Need to see something in your records." Beaumont's eyebrows rose. "Our records are confidential, sir." "Just want to confirm my payment history," Emmett said. "Been paying on time for 15 years before this. Trouble started. Well, I suppose that's reasonable." Beaumont turned to the tall cabinets behind him, fingers trailing across labeled drawers until he found the one he sought. He withdrew a thick folder and placed it on the counter, careful to angle it away from Emmett's direct view. "Yes, your payments were indeed regular until the most recent quarter." From the doorway to the bank's back office, a young clerk watched their exchange with undisguised interest. He was new, hired when the bank expanded last fall, brought in from the territorial capital with Judge Thorne's endorsement. "Been thinking about the judge's other purchases," Emmett said casually. "Seems he's bought up a fair amount of land recently." Beaumont's fingers stilled on the page. "I couldn't possibly discuss other clients' business." "Course not," Emmett agreed. "Just curious about the timing. All those properties coming up for auction around the same time. Almost like someone knew which lands would be valuable before the railroad announced its route." The clerk in the doorway shifted uncomfortably, then disappeared into the back room. Beaumont glanced after him, a flicker of something, concern, fear, crossing his face. "Mr. Callahan, I really must insist." The back door opened again, and the clerk returned. He moved to Beaumont's side and whispered something urgently. The banker's face paled slightly. "Excuse me a moment," Beaumont said, following the clerk into the back room. Left alone at the counter, Emmett didn't move. Through the thin wall, he could hear raised voices. The clerk's insistent, Beaumont's defensive. A drawer opened and closed. When the banker returned, his composure had slipped visibly. Behind him, the clerk carried a different ledger, bound in black leather with gold lettering on the spine. The young man placed it on a side table, deliberately in Emmett's line of sight, then left the front door. "As I was saying," Beaumont continued, his voice slightly higher than before, "I cannot discuss other clients' affairs." Emmett nodded toward the black ledger. "That's not your regular account book." "No, it's..." Beaumont hesitated. "It's the Special Acquisitions Ledger, for property transitions handled directly through Judge Thorne's office." "Mind if I have a look?" "That would be highly irregular. So's a judge buying up land along a railroad route before the route's announced publicly," Emmett countered. Their eyes held for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bank's windows in their frames. The sound seemed to break Beaumont's resolve. 2 minutes, he said quietly, sliding the black ledger across the counter. "I need to check something in the vault." He disappeared into the back, leaving Emmett alone with the book. The pages fell open easily, well-thumbed and much used. Inside, in meticulous handwriting, were records of land acquisitions, dates, prices, seller names. 7 properties in the last year, all along the same watershed. All purchased after financial difficulties suddenly befell their owners. Emmett ran his finger down the list, recognizing names. Wilson's Place had been first. The old man had died of fever just before his taxes came due. Then the Murphy farm, foreclosed after Murphy broke his leg and couldn't work his fields. Each story followed a pattern: hardship, then foreclosure, then purchase at a fraction of true value. At the back of the ledger was a map, carefully annotated with property lines. The parcels formed a nearly continuous line along what Emmett now recognized as an underground water route, exactly as Sarah had described from her grandfather's notes. The front door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and the young clerk, snow dusting his shoulders. His expression changed to alarm when he saw Emmett with the ledger. "Sir, you can't—" "Just leaving," Emmett said, closing the book. "Got what I needed." Outside, Hank Redfeather waited with their wagon, the horses stomping impatiently in the cold. The blacksmith raised an eyebrow in question. 7 properties, Emmett confirmed, climbing up beside him. All along the water route, just like Sarah said. Hank clicked to the horses, turning them toward home. Judge won't like that, you know? Judge doesn't know that I know, Emmett corrected. But his clerk does. Young man looked mighty uncomfortable with what's happening. The wagon creaked as it moved through fresh snow, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. As they passed the church, Emmett noticed Preacher Wilson watching from his doorway, expression unreadable. Ain't just your land he's after, Hank said as they left town behind. It's a water route to the new rail line that cuts across all these properties. A wet snow fell through the gray dawn, more water than crystal. March had arrived, bringing with it a slow surrender of winter's grip. Icicles dripped from the eaves, their steady patter a constant backdrop to the morning quiet. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, the first hint of thaw beneath the lingering cold. Emmett sat alone at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning against the pre-dawn darkness. Before him lay two documents, the judge's generous offer for his land and the notification of wardship hearing. The paper felt rough beneath his calloused fingertips as he traced the official seals and signatures. Outside, the world was still half asleep. No sounds yet from the barn where Hank had taken to sleeping, keeping watch over the property as the auction date drew near. No stirring from the rooms where the girls slept, their breathing soft and even when he'd checked before coming down. The chair creaked beneath Emmett as he shifted his weight. In the thin light, he looked older than his years, the lines around his eyes deeper, the silver in his hair more pronounced. The land had shaped him as surely as he had shaped it, each year leaving its mark. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Hannah appeared in the doorway, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, a woolen shawl clutched tight across her nightdress. "You been sitting there all night?" she asked, voice rough with sleep. Emmett didn't answer directly. "Made coffee," he said instead, gesturing toward the pot on the stove. Hannah poured herself a cup, the liquid steaming in the cool room. She settled across from him, eyes taking in the papers spread before him. "Thinking of taking his offer?" "Thinking I might not have a choice." The admission cost him something to voice aloud. "Because of the girl." Emmett nodded. "Hearings in 3 days. Judge made it clear. He'll declare her a ward of the county, put her in that orphan asylum over in Hayes County. Unless you sign over the land," Hannah finished. It wasn't a question. "Said he'd make sure she stays here if I do." Emmett's hands closed into fists on the tabletop. Called it a humanitarian consideration. Hannah's mouth tightened. Man wouldn't know humanity if it kicked him in the teeth. The kitchen began to lighten as the sun rose behind the clouds. The falling snow caught the strengthening light, turning from gray to silver. Hannah rose to stoke the stove, the iron door creaking as she added wood. Heat bloomed outward, pushing back against the morning chill. "Land's been in my family 3 generations, Emmett said finally. "Worked it with my father, then alone. Always figured I'd pass it to my son someday." "The Lord had other plans," Hannah said softly. They both knew the grief that lived in those words. The wife and infant son Emmett had buried 20 years past, victims of a winter fever that had swept through the territory. "Never thought I'd have to choose between the land and a child." Emmett's voice was barely audible. "A child that ain't even mine by blood." "Blood ain't the only thing that makes family," Hannah replied. Her worn hand covered his briefly. "You think on how that girl looks at you, like you hung the moon and stars. Been looking for a safe harbor her whole young life, I expect." A soft sound from the doorway drew their attention. The older Sarah stood there, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes too knowing for her years. "I can go," she said simply. "Been on my own before. Can do it again." "No." The word came sharper than Emmett intended. "You're not going anywhere. But your land is just dirt and rock without people to work it." Emmett pushed back from the table, his decision crystallizing even as he spoke it. "Land doesn't love you back, doesn't grow up to have a life of its own. It just is." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "You'd give up everything for me?" Emmett looked at the child standing before him, brave, determined, far older than her years. In the weeks since her arrival, she'd become as much a part of his life as the land itself. The thought of her in some cold county institution turned his stomach. From the back of the house came the sounds of the younger Sarah waking, her small feet padding across the floor. Hannah rose to tend to her, leaving Emmett and the older girl alone with the weight of unsaid words between them. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do, Emmett said finally, is surrender what he loves to save what matters more. Hank Redfeather's forge blazed hot against the early March evening, pushing back the darkness that settled early beyond the blacksmith's open doors. The shop smelled of coal smoke and hot metal, with undertones of the horse liniment Hank made in the back room. A steady rain had begun to fall outside, drumming against the tin roof like impatient fingers. Emmett watched as the blacksmith heated a small copper bowl in the heart of the fire, the metal slowly changing color as the temperature rose. Inside the bowl, a mixture of powders and oil bubbled gently. "My grandfather taught me this," Hank explained, carefully adjusting the bowl's position in the flames. "Old Lakota method for revealing hidden marks on tanned hides." Sarah sat perched on a stool nearby, her grandfather's satchel open on her lap. She had been sorting through the papers all afternoon, matching survey notes to landmarks they'd found along the property lines. The bank clerk, young Peterson, had slipped her additional information that morning, passing a folded map to her in the general store, while pretending to help her reach a high shelf. "Will it damage the deed?" Emmett asked, watching the mixture change from dull brown to a deep amber. "Shouldn't," Hank replied, "but it might be our only chance to prove the authentication mark is there." The blacksmith shop door opened, letting in a gust of damp air and Marcus Beaumont. The banker removed his hat, water streaming from the brim onto the packed dirt floor. His face was pale, his movements jerky with nerves. "You shouldn't be here," he said without preamble. "Judge has men watching the shop." "You shouldn't either," Emmett replied. "Yet here you stand." Beaumont glanced toward the open door, as if expecting to find someone following him. "Peterson showed me the ledger. What Judge Thorne's been doing, it isn't right." "Taking you long enough to see it," Hank observed, not looking up from his work. "I have a family," the banker said defensively, "a position in the community." "So does everyone he's ruined," Sarah said quietly. Beaumont had no answer for that. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather folio. "The original documentation for your property," he explained, handing it to Emmett, "filed with the Territorial Land Office before Judge Thorne arrived. Peterson made copies." Emmett opened the folio. Inside were survey notes, boundary descriptions, and a duplicate of his deed, with the complete notary seal clearly visible. "This is what Judge Thorne removed from the records," Beaumont confirmed. "He's been systematically altering documents to create legal questions about properties he wants." Sarah slid from her stool, coming to examine the papers. "Just like he did in Missouri," she murmured. "And before that, in Kansas." "The circuit judge arrives tomorrow for the auction hearings," Beaumont continued. "Judge Thorne has already prepared all the documentation to show your deed is invalid." "Unless we can prove otherwise," Emmett said. Hank removed the copper bowl from the fire, the mixture inside now a deep, translucent gold. The smell had changed, taking on a sharp, astringent quality that made eyes water. "Ancient wisdom," the blacksmith said, setting the bowl on his workbench. "Fire doesn't just reveal what metals are made of, it shows what men are made of, too." He gestured for Emmett to place the deed on the bench. With practiced hands, Hank dipped a small brush into the mixture and began carefully applying it to the edges of the document where the notary seal was stamped. The liquid glistened in the firelight, soaking into the aged paper. "Now we wait," he said, stepping back. "If there's a hidden authentication mark, this will find it." Beaumont shifted nervously. "I should get back. If Judge Thorne suspects I've been here—" "Go," Emmett said. "You've done enough." The banker nodded once, replacing his hat. At the door, he paused. "The auction is at noon tomorrow. Judge Thorne has already arranged for buyers from the capital." After he left, silence filled the shop, broken only by the hiss and pop of the forge and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Sarah moved to stand beside Emmett, her small hand finding his. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked, voice barely audible over the rain. Emmett squeezed her hand gently. "Then we face whatever comes together." Hank watched the deed closely, eyes intent on the treated area. "It's starting to change," he murmured. The paper had begun to darken where the mixture was applied, but something else was happening as well. Faint lines appeared, growing more distinct as they watched, an intricate pattern within the notary seal that had been invisible before. "That's it," Sarah breathed, leaning closer. "Grandfather's mark, the surveyor's compass rose. He always hid it in the official seals." Hank carefully applied more of the mixture, revealing the complete design. A small compass rose with an arrow pointing true north, exactly like the mark they'd found on the boundary stone. "Fire don't just destroy," the blacksmith said softly, a smile creasing his weathered face. It reveals what's been there all along if you know how to read the signs. Auction day dawned crisp and clear, the first truly spring-like morning of the year. The sun rose like a pale gold coin above the eastern horizon, burning away the last wisps of ground fog that clung to the hollows and creek beds. Birds called from newly budding trees, their songs carrying across fields still patched with melting snow. The town square filled early, wagons and horses lined the hitching posts, and knots of people gathered on the courthouse steps, voices a low murmur of anticipation. The auction platform had been erected the previous day, a simple wooden stage with a podium at its center, facing the crowd. Emmett stood at the edge of the gathering, hat in hand, his best coat brushed free of dust for the occasion. Beside him, Hank Redfeather waited silently, a leather satchel containing the treated deed held carefully under one arm. They had decided against bringing the girls, leaving them in Hannah's care at the ranch. Some battles children shouldn't have to witness. Judge Thorne arrived in a polished black buggy, stepping down with practiced dignity. He wore a tailored suit and carried a silver-topped walking stick that caught the morning sunlight. Behind him came his clerk and 3 men Emmett recognized from the territorial capital, railroad investors with pockets deep enough to buy half the county. The murmuring grew as people noticed Emmett's arrival. Heads turned, conversations paused and resumed with greater intensity. From the church steps, Preacher Wilson watched with a troubled expression, his Bible clutched tight against his chest. "Half the county turned out," Hank observed quietly. "Word travels fast." "Judge made sure of it," Emmett replied. "Wants witnesses to his victory." Sheriff Taylor approached, hat in hand, discomfort evident in his stiff posture. "Emmett," he greeted, voice low. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," Emmett said. "Man's entitled to watch his own hanging." The sheriff winced at the metaphor. "Look, for what it's worth, I think what's happening ain't right, but my hands are tied by the law." "Law's only as straight as the men enforcing it," Hank observed. Before Taylor could respond, a bell rang from the courthouse, signaling the start of proceedings. The crowd parted as Judge Thorne mounted the platform, his movements deliberate and confident. The clerk arranged papers on the podium while the judge surveyed the assembled townspeople. "Good citizens of Broken Elm," he began, voice projecting to the back of the crowd. "We gather today for a most important territorial auction. Progress comes to all communities, and with it, necessary change in stewardship of key properties." The crowd shifted, attention focused on the judge's words. Emmett remained still, watching not Thorne but the faces around him, neighbors he'd known for decades, some avoiding his eyes, others offering small nods of solidarity. "First parcel," Thorne continued, "the Callahan homestead, 160 acres with water rights, structures included, opening bid set at $850. A murmur ran through the crowd at the low price, less than half what the property was worth. One of the railroad men raised his hand immediately. $850 from Mr. Hargrove, the judge noted with satisfaction. "Do I hear $900? The second investor raised his hand. $900. $950, called the third, not bothering to wait for Thorne's acknowledgement. Emmett watched the choreographed bidding with a calmness that surprised even him. The night had brought a strange peace, the certainty of a man who had made his choice and found it right in his soul. The bidding continued, climbing steadily but still well below true value. When it reached $1,200, Judge Thorne's smile widened. "Going once on the Callahan property, unless there's someone with proper claim to say otherwise?" Emmett stepped forward then, moving through the crowd which parted before him like water around a stone. Boot heels struck wooden steps as he mounted the platform, coming to stand beside the podium. The judge's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Callahan," he said, voice tight, "this is most irregular. If you wish to contest the proceedings, you should have filed proper documents." "I'm here to set the record straight," Emmett interrupted, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. His gaze swept across the gathered townsfolk, people who had known him all his life, who had watched him work his land through drought and bounty, through loss and solitude. "This auction is based on a lie," he continued. "A lie that says my deed is invalid, a lie that says my claim is in question." He turned to face Judge Thorne directly. "A lie told by a man who's been falsifying records to steal land all along the water route to the new railroad." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Thorne's face darkened, his knuckles whitening on his walking stick. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Callahan," he said, voice dangerous. "Without evidence, they amount to slander against a territorial official." Got my evidence right here. Emmett nodded to Hank, who mounted the platform and handed him the leather satchel. And witnesses ready to testify to your methods. From the edge of the crowd, Marcus Beaumont stepped forward, followed by the young clerk Peterson. The banker's face was pale but determined. The territorial circuit judge should be very interested in the special acquisitions ledger, Emmett continued, removing the treated deed from the satchel. Shows a pattern of land theft stretching back to your arrival in this territory. The morning sun caught the document as Emmett held it up, illuminating the now visible surveyor's mark within the notary seal. Judge Thorne's confidence visibly wavered as he recognized what he was seeing. This deed bears the authentic mark of Surveyor Thomas Elkins, Emmett declared, loud enough for all to hear, the same mark found on the original boundary stones of every property in this county, including those you've already stolen through falsified documents. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and for the first time, uncertainty showed in Judge Thorne's eyes. Standing on that platform with the morning sun warming his back, Emmett Callahan felt taller than he had in years. Hank's hammer struck the anvil with practiced precision, sending a shower of sparks dancing through the air. The ringing sound echoed across the town square, where the auction platform had been hastily converted to a demonstration stage. The crowd that had gathered for the auction remained, their attention now fixed on the blacksmith's work. The territorial circuit judge, a lean, serious man named Franklin, who had arrived unexpectedly that morning, stood beside Sheriff Taylor, watching the proceedings with sharp eyes. He had immediately called for a halt to the auction upon hearing Emmett's accusations, demanding to see all evidence. The technique is ancient, Hank explained as he worked, his voice carrying to the assembled onlookers. Heat and certain compounds reveal marks invisible to the naked eye. On a small table before him lay 3 documents, Emmett's deed, a copy of the territorial land grant, and Sarah's grandfather's journal, open to a page describing his authentication method. The blacksmith had built a small portable forge, its coals glowing orange in the spring sunlight. Emmett stood nearby, watching as Hank carefully applied the amber mixture to a corner of the territorial document where an official seal was stamped. The liquid glistened, then slowly soaked into the paper. Judge Thorne stood under guard, his face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him, his clerk shifted nervously, eyes darting between his employer and the growing evidence of fraud. The surveyor's mark appears when heated, Hank continued, holding the treated paper near the forge's warmth. A compass rose with an arrow pointing true north, Thomas Elkins' personal authentication mark. As he spoke, the mark began to appear on the document, faint at first, then growing more distinct. A murmur ran through the crowd as people pressed closer to see. The same mark, Emmett added, that appears on the boundary stones along my property line, and every other original property in this county. Judge Franklin stepped forward, examining the revealed mark with careful attention. And you claim Judge Thorne has been altering documents to remove evidence of these marks? Not just altering, came a young voice from the edge of the crowd. The older Sarah pushed forward, her grandfather's satchel clutched in her arms. Behind her, Hannah and the younger Sarah followed, having decided to come to town despite Emmett's wishes. He's been doing this for years, Sarah continued, her voice stronger than Emmett had ever heard it. In Missouri, then Kansas, now here, following the railroad surveys, buying up land through false claims before routes are announced. Judge Franklin's gaze sharpened. And you are? Sarah Elkins, she replied, chin high. Thomas Elkins was my grandfather. These are his original survey notes for this territory. She opened the satchel, withdrawing carefully preserved journals and maps. He documented everything, including the water route Judge Thorne has been acquiring through falsified foreclosures. Thorne lunged forward suddenly. This is absurd. The ravings of a child and a desperate old man trying to save his worthless land. Sheriff Taylor caught the judge's arm, pulling him back. The walking stick clattered to the ground, the silver head breaking free to reveal a hidden compartment containing a small, precisely made stamp, a replica of a territorial seal, but with subtle differences. Judge Franklin knelt to examine the fallen object. A counterfeit seal, he observed, voice cold with authority. Used to create falsified documents, I presume. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Preacher Wilson pushed forward, his face troubled. Is this true, Judge Thorne? Have you been falsifying land claims? Before Thorne could answer, the young bank clerk stepped forward. It's all documented in the special acquisitions ledger, he said, his voice shaking slightly. 7 properties taken through manipulated foreclosures in the past year alone. Judge Franklin straightened, his expression grim. Sheriff Taylor, take Judge Thorne into custody. I'm ordering an immediate review of all property transactions conducted under his authority. As the sheriff led a protesting Thorne away, Sarah came to stand beside Emmett. Her small hand found his, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. Your grandfather would be proud, Emmett told her softly. The territorial judge turned to Emmett, offering a formal nod. Mr. Callahan, it appears a grave injustice was nearly done here today. Your deed is valid, your land remains your own. The crowd began to disperse as Judge Franklin called for all relevant documents to be brought to the courthouse. Hank carefully packed away his demonstration materials, a satisfied smile creasing his weathered face. Seems there's 2 frauds exposed today, he observed quietly. A paper and a judge. The first week of April brought rain that washed the last patches of snow from the fields, transforming the world from winter's monochrome to spring's tentative green. New grass pushed through mud, stubborn and bright as hope itself. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility, carrying the promise of growth after dormancy. Broken Elm buzzed with the news of Judge Thorne's arrest. The Territorial Circuit Court had extended its stay, methodically reviewing every land transaction conducted under Thorne's authority. Properties wrongfully taken were being returned to their original owners, deeds restored with proper authentication. Emmett stood on the courthouse steps, watching as families emerged from within, clutching restored documents with expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to tearful gratitude. The Murphy widow held her papers to her chest like a newborn child, her weathered face transformed by joy. Old Wilson's son shook Emmett's hand so hard it nearly pulled him off balance. Never thought we'd see justice done, Wilson said, voice rough with emotion. Not against a man like Thorne. The courthouse door opened again, and more townsfolk emerged into the spring sunshine. Among them walked Preacher Wilson, his face somber as he approached Emmett. I owe you an apology, the preacher said without preamble. I let myself be swayed by promises of progress and prosperity, failed to see the corruption beneath. Emmett considered the man before him, not a bad sort, just easily led by authority and the promise of town growth. Reckon we all get blinded sometimes, he offered. What matters is seeing clear when it counts. From across the square, Sheriff Taylor waved, beckoning Emmett to the jail, where Judge Franklin had set up temporary chambers. As Emmett crossed the muddy ground, boots sinking slightly with each step, he noticed how differently people looked at him now, with respect rather than pity, with admiration rather than judgment. Inside the jail, Judge Franklin sat behind a desk piled high with documents. His spectacles reflected the light from the window as he looked up at Emmett's entrance. Mr. Callahan, he greeted, gesturing to a chair. I wanted to inform you personally that all charges regarding improper guardianship have been dismissed. Judge Thorne's claims were, like so much else, fabricated to pressure you into surrendering your land. Relief washed through Emmett, though he kept his expression measured. Appreciate that, Your Honor. Furthermore, Franklin continued, given the circumstances, I've expedited the adoption paperwork you filed this morning. He slid a document across the desk. Effective immediately, Sarah Elkins is legally your ward, with all rights and protections that entails. Emmett took the paper, the official seal catching the light. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Thank you. No, Mr. Callahan, Franklin said, rising to offer his hand. Thank you. Your stubbornness, he smiled slightly at the word, has exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued unchecked. The territorial governor sends his personal gratitude. Outside, the town had begun to gather. Word of the judge's decisions had spread, drawing people to the square in small groups and families. As Emmett emerged with his adoption papers, a cheer rose spontaneously from the crowd. Hannah pushed forward through the throng, both Sarahs in tow. The girls' faces lit up when they saw him, and the older Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of the document in his hand. Is that... she began, voice trembling slightly. Emmett nodded. Official papers. You're staying with us. Legal and proper. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward, the Murphy widow, Wilson's son, Beaumont, the banker, even Preacher Wilson. Each offered a hand, a word of thanks, an acknowledgement of Emmett's stand against corruption. Ain't never seen folks line up to shake a stubborn old rancher's hand before, Hank observed, appearing at Emmett's side. A debt ain't just what's owed to banks, Emmett replied quietly. It's what we owe each other. The apple trees behind Emmett's house had burst into bloom, their branches heavy with white blossoms that perfumed the spring air. Bees hummed among the flowers, their busy drone a counterpoint to the softer sounds of evening settling across the land, cattle lowing in distant pastures, chickens clucking as they returned to their roosts. Emmett sat on the porch steps, his grandfather's spyglass resting on his knee. The brass had been polished to a warm glow, the leather wrapping oiled to protect it from wear. Beside him, the older Sarah watched as he carefully adjusted the focus ring. "It's been in my family since before the war," he explained. "My grandfather used it to survey this very land, back when all this was just wild territory." Sarah touched the brass cylinder with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful." "Useful too," Emmett said. "Helps a person see what's coming, prepare for it." He held it out to her. "Thought you might like to have it now." The girl's eyes widened. "Me? But it's your family's." "Your family now," Emmett replied simply. "Papers say so, but more than that, my heart says so." From the garden behind the house came the sound of laughter as Hannah and the younger Sarah planted the season's first vegetable seeds. The soil had finally dried enough for planting, the earth warm and receptive beneath their hands. Hank approached from the direction of the newly built forge that stood beside the barn. His arms were smudged with coal dust, but his step was light as he crossed the yard. "Town council voted this morning," he announced. "Beaumont's been appointed interim judge until the territorial appointment comes through." "He'll do right," Emmett nodded. "Man learned his lesson about standing up when it matters." The blacksmith settled on the step below them, stretching his long legs before him. Railroad Commission came through too, confirmed they'll be putting a water station on the Wilson property, paying fair market value, with proper contracts. The three sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The evening light turned the world golden, casting long shadows across land that had nearly been lost. Sarah raised the spyglass to her eye, focusing on the distant boundary marker they had uncovered months earlier. "I can see all the way to the creek," she marveled. "That's yours now, too," Emmett told her. "To learn, to work, maybe to inherit someday." "I never thought I'd have a home again," Sarah said softly. "Not after my parents died. Been running so long, I almost forgot what it felt like to stay somewhere." Hannah called from the garden, waving them over to see the neat rows she and the younger Sarah had planted. The smell of fresh-turned earth rose rich and promising in the evening air. As they walked toward the garden, Emmett placed a hand gently on Sarah's shoulder. The weight of it felt right, as natural as the changing seasons or the return of birds in spring. "Some things you fight for," he said as they crossed the yard together. "Some things find you, the best things do both."